Autoridades presentes, senhoras e senhores, boa noite. É com grande satisfação que o Centro Mackenzie de Liberdade Econômica, vinculado ao CCSA, Centro de Ciências Sociais e Aplicadas, os recebem para a palestra e para o lançamento do livro A Faca Entrou, Assassinos, Reais e a Nossa Cultura, do autor Theodore Dalrymple, publicado pela editora Realizações. Somos uma instituição de ensino confessional que tem a missão de contribuir na vida dos indivíduos e também na sociedade. Portanto, temos como prática iniciar nossos eventos com uma reflexão, para a qual convidamos o capelão universitário, reverendo Marcelo Coelho.
Boa noite a todos. No tema que será tratado hoje, eu trago a contribuição da compreensão do Evangelho sobre quem é o ser humano. E tratar de um tema tão importante, tão interdisciplinar como esse que nós vamos ter aqui hoje, implica em sabermos algumas coisas sobre nós mesmos, naquilo que o Evangelho nos ensina. João Calvino dizia que, à medida em que nós conhecemos a Deus, nós conhecemos a nós mesmos. E falar de despreparo ou desvirtuamento ou qualquer tipo de desencaminhamento do ser humano implica em lidarmos com essa origem quebrada. Qual? A do conhecimento de Deus. E eu quero ler um trecho da carta aos Romanos, em que mostra onde é que nasce, na perspectiva do apóstolo Paulo, qualquer tipo de distorção de comportamentos humanos. E ele diz que isso nasce devido ao ser humano desprezar o conhecimento de Deus. E que quaisquer que sejam as atitudes erradas dos seres humanos, em certo sentido, uma devolução de Deus, em liberar o ser agir pelos seus próprios intentos, uma vez que desprezou o conhecimento de Deus. A minha fala é muito curta, por isso eu fiz essa introdução, porque o mais importante aqui é a leitura bíblica. E eu convido você a dar essa atenção à leitura final do capítulo 1 de Romanos, que diz assim: E por haverem desprezado o conhecimento de Deus, o próprio Deus os entregou a uma disposição mental reprovável para praticarem coisas inconvenientes, cheios de toda injustiça, malícia, avareza, maldade, possuidores de inveja, homicídio, contenda, dolo e malignidade, sendo difamadores, caluniadores, aborrecidos de Deus, insolentes, soberbos, presunçosos, inventores de males, desobedientes aos pais, insensatos, pérfidos, sem afeição natural e sem misericórdia. Ora, continua o apóstolo Paulo, conhecendo eles a sentença de Deus, de que são passíveis de morte todos os que tais coisas praticam, não somente as fazem, mas também aprovam os que assim procedem. Como eu disse, eu queria dar destaque à leitura que nos coloca todos os seres humanos numa condição absolutamente similar, comparando homicidas e desobedientes aos pais. Por quê? O distanciamento mental de Deus, do conhecimento de Deus, que nos é dado até mesmo pela criação que nos foi dada, nos leva a essa disposição mental reprovável aos olhos de Deus para praticar todas essas coisas inconvenientes. Eu termino essa reflexão lembrando algo que o Senhor Jesus falou acerca disso. Ele disse que tudo isso nasce no coração humano, No Evangelho de Mateus, no capítulo 15, versículo 19, ele diz: porque do coração é que procedem os maus desígnios, homicídios, adultérios, prostituição, furtos, falsos testemunhos, blasfêmias e assim por diante. Por esta razão, porque o pecado atingiu toda a raça humana, é que nesse mesmo capítulo de Romanos, o apóstolo Paulo introduz a sua apresentação do Evangelho com o texto que causou toda uma revolução no coração de Martinho Lutero há 500 anos atrás. Ele diz: por isso eu não me envergonho do Evangelho, porque é o poder de Deus para a salvação de todo aquele que crê, tanto do judeu como grego, representando todos os religiosos e não religiosos. A minha reflexão termina com uma oração em meu coração, para que possamos, a partir de hoje, das sessões que teremos, conhecer um pouco mais do ser humano, na perspectiva do nosso palestrante, uma grande contribuição que ele tem dado à sociedade e pôde compartilhar isso conosco aqui no Mackenzie, motivo de grande honra para todos nós. E que o Senhor também nos abençoe nesse intento. Amém.
Gostaríamos de registrar e agradecer a presença das autoridades do Instituto Presbiteriano Mackenzie, saudando o Dr. Cabreira Mano Filho, membro do Conselho de Curadores e Conselho Deliberativo, das autoridades da Universidade Presbiteriana Mackenzie, saudando o diretor do Centro de Ciências Sociais e Aplicadas, professor Dr. Adilson Aderito da Silva, do editor da E-Realizações, senhor Edson Filho, dos docentes, discentes e demais participantes. Convidamos agora o coordenador do Centro Mackenzie de Liberdade Econômica, professor Dr. Vladimir Fernandes Maciel, para realizar sua saudação.
Boa noite, é com muito orgulho que eu agradeço a presença de todos neste auditório, nessa casa cheia. E é importante ressaltar que esse evento é do Centro Mackenzie Liberdade Econômica, mas é da Universidade Presbiteriana Mackenzie, em parceria com a E-Realizações, com o Instituto Liberal de São Paulo e com o Instituto de Estudos Empresariais de Porto Alegre, ambos membros da Rede Liberdade, da qual o Centro Mackenzie Liberdade Econômica faz parte. Acreditamos que este evento de hoje é um marco importante porque nós faremos uma discussão multidisciplinar que envolve toda a universidade. Muito obrigado pela presença de todos e tenham uma boa noite.
Antes de iniciarmos a nossa palestra, temos alguns avisos. Os livros estão à venda na entrada do auditório e logo após as perguntas da plateia, teremos uma sessão de autógrafos com o autor. Os alunos que desejarem horas complementares deverão registrar sua presença pelo TIA no hall deste auditório. E agora convidamos o professor do Centro Mackenzie de Liberdade Econômica, Lucas Grace Freire, para realizar a apresentação do palestrante.
Theodore Dalrymple é o pseudônimo de Anthony Daniels, psiquiatra britânico com décadas de experiência em prisões e em periferia de grandes cidades, não apenas na Inglaterra, mas também na América Latina, na África e no leste europeu. Soma ao seu trabalho como médico uma vasta erudição e uma muito elogiada habilidade literária, que o tornam um dos mais talentosos ensaístas e um dos mais polêmicos críticos culturais da atualidade. Nos artigos que escreve para veículos como The Times, The Salisbury Review, National Review, The Daily Telegraph, The Observer e The Spectator, tem despontado como um ácido crítico do politicamente correto, da vitimização e do sentimentalismo, que são, segundo ele, estimulados pela noção contemporânea de estado de bem-estar social. Dalrymple é um membro sênior do Manhattan Institute e foi vencedor do Prêmio da Liberdade em 2011, na Holanda. De sua autoria, a Realizações Editora já publicou 11 livros, todos com grande sucesso de vendas. A Vida na Sarjeta, Nossa Cultura ou o que Restou dela, Podres de Mimados, Em Defesa do Preconceito, O Prazer de Pensar, Qualquer Coisa Serve, A Nova Síndrome de Vichy, Não como um estrondo, mas com um gemido, Viagens aos Confins do Comunismo, Evasivas Admiráveis, e o mais recente, tanto no Brasil como no Reino Unido, A Faca Entrou. O auditório poderá fazer perguntas depois da fala do Dr. Daniels, nesse cartão que foi recebido, e peço que entreguem o cartão à equipe de apoio, para que depois haja uma sessão de perguntas e respostas. Bom proveito a todos.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, first I should like to thank Mackenzie University for having invited me here to speak to you today, and I should like to apologize for not speaking Portuguese. Eu não falo português, então I have to speak in English. And I should also particularly like to thank Edson Filho and all his team at Realizações for publishing my books in Brazil, and his whole splendid team, because I'm very grateful. I never imagined that anyone in Brazil would publish my books here, or that any of them would be of any interest to Brazilians, because, of course, most of them are about England, and I assume that the difference between England or British society and Brazilian society was so great that only those people who were interested in Britain would be interested in my books. Of course, human nature is the same everywhere, but there are nevertheless quite wide variations in how it manifests itself. So I hope that you will forgive me if I talk mainly about my experiences in England. My latest book is a memoir of my life in prison, or perhaps I should say my life in prison as a doctor. In fact, I did spend more time probably than many bank robbers in prison. It was quite a large prison by British standards, maybe not by Brazilian standards. It had about 1,400 prisoners, and I worked there for about 15 years, and I was on duty. I was a psychiatrist, but I also did ordinary medical work, and I was on duty there for one night in 3 or 4, and one weekend in 3 or 4, as well as going there almost every day. And I used to work in the prison, in the hospital, which was immediately next door. The two institutions were very close together. And the biggest difference between them, really, was that there was much more violence in the hospital. I used to walk from the hospital to the prison every afternoon, and it was about 600 meters. And on the way there were parked cars, and by doing this I discovered one of the greatest and most important causes of crime in England. When the weather was good, which of course in England is not very often, when the weather was good, many of the cars en route on the way had been broken into. The windows were smashed and something was stolen from the cars, and actually the glass from the windows sparkled prettily on the ground. But when it was cold or raining, as of course it often is in England, luckily for owners of cars, none of the cars had ever been broken into. And it follows from this, at least, according to a certain way of thinking about social problems, that one of the biggest causes of car crime, at any rate in England, is sunshine. And the association was actually very close, and much closer than with some of the things that sociologists and criminologists have suggested. And I dare say that neuroscientists will soon be putting people into scanning machines to find out what it is about sunshine that makes them break into cars. Now, I have to admit that I feel slightly uneasy about talking of these matters, because personally I have led a fairly privileged life, and I've never suffered from poverty, at any rate poverty that wasn't the result of my own very foolish choices. And I also knew that when I made those choices, I would not face absolute destitution. And some people might say, well, by what right does a relatively privileged person like you speak of people who have had actually much harder lives, at least harder lives to all appearances? And here I am reminded of what heroin addicts used to say to me when I told them that as a matter of medical fact, withdrawal symptoms from heroin, many of the criminals were heroin addicts, the withdrawal effects from heroin are actually medically trivial. They're not worse than a viral illness, contrary to what the view that is propagated in films and so on. It is not serious. And they always said, when I said that, they always said, well, how do you know? Because you've never had withdrawal symptoms, so how can you say that they're not serious? Well, I would reply that personal experience is not the only way of obtaining knowledge. I've never had cerebral malaria, but I know that it's very serious. In other words, personal experience can claim no monopoly as a method of knowledge. It is useful and important, of course, and I don't want to decry it, but it has to be combined with other sources of knowledge in order to understand reality. And no one, after all, can experience everything. Moreover, the connection between, say, childhood experience and poverty and all subsequent behavior is not absolutely straightforward. If it were absolutely straightforward, to say that of someone that he is poor would be the same as saying that he is criminal. Or to say that he is criminal is to say that he is poor. But this is clearly not the case. I've worked amongst the poor for much of my life, and I include the relatively poor amongst those people. And they showed the same variation of moral characteristics as any other group of people. It is, of course, easier, much easier, to behave well or with grace or to stay within the law when one has had an easy life. But that's not the same as saying that a hard life necessarily results in bad behavior and crime. And to give you just one example, I lived for 3 years in a country called Tanzania in Africa, the east coast of Africa, which was at the time, and probably still is, one of the poorest countries in the world. Much, much poorer than Brazil, incomparably poorer than Brazil. But the people were, on the whole, very beautifully mannered, and I never had to fear being attacked anywhere in Tanzania. Poverty is not only not the same as crime, it is not the same even of crudity of manner. And it's very condescending to the poor to assume that it is. Well, anyway, when I went to work in the prison in England where I worked, I was soon very forcibly struck by the fact that all the murderers who had killed their victims by stabbing them with a knife, when asked to describe what had happened, said, "The knife went in. A Faca Entrou." And I used this phrase, obviously, for the title of my book. The knife went in. This is a very odd way of putting it. It implies that it is the knife rather than the hand which guided the knife which killed. And I even had one murderer who blamed not the fact that he had put the knife in to someone, but the fact that the doctor took the knife out. And that was what killed the person. And actually, strictly medically speaking, that's not completely impossible. But nevertheless, what he meant was that it was not really me. And this kind of way of speaking, the knife went in, occurred in other cases as well. I remember a man who had shot dead his enemy, and what he said was, a fight broke out, a gun arrived, and it went off. So here the fight is something, it's like a meteorological phenomenon, a cold front or something like that, or a shower of rain, something that just happens independently of any human volition. The gun arrived spontaneously, again without any human volition. It was a force of nature. The gun just came itself. And the gun discharged itself. It went off without anyone having pulled the trigger. And very fortunately for this man, it happened to kill the man with whom he was having a fight. Now, I think that it's true that this way of talking is commonplace, and probably we all do it from time to time, perhaps often. When one has done something wrong, at least when I say one, I mean I, actually. When I have done something wrong, the first thing I do is to think of excuses for myself. So if, for example, I say anything silly now, it's because I'm still a little jet-lagged. So if I say anything silly, it's not me. It's the aeroplane. But even as you say these things, again, I'm using my own personal experience, and I think personal experience is important. My experience is that there is a still small voice at the back of your head, actually mine is about here, which tells you even while you are making excuses for yourself, you are actually not telling the truth. You're lying to yourself. And we may even begin to understand that we actually enjoyed being angry, for example, and that we were beginning to have a nice time while we were behaving badly. And there are some people, no doubt, who, by inclination, do behave badly. One occasionally comes across people who have done very wrong things almost from the moment they had any choice. Whenever they had the choice, they did very bad things. Such people exist, and it appears almost like a neurological condition. But that's not most people. I used to ask heroin addicts who came to prison why they had started to take heroin. Almost without exception, they would reply, "I fell in with the wrong crowd." What they meant by this was that by some kind of accident, they met the wrong types of people. And I used to say to them, when they said this, well, it is strange how often I meet people who fell in with the wrong crowd, but I never meet any member of the wrong crowd itself. And curiously enough, they all knew exactly what I meant, what I was trying to say, and they didn't grow angry, they laughed, because they knew then that I understood that they were lying. It's often said that prisoners are of defective education and intelligence, which accounts, at least in part, for their behavior, for their conduct. In other words, unable as they are, through lack of education and intelligence, to make their way through life normally, they resort to dishonesty and violence for lack of any other method of going through life. But the fact that the prisoners, the heroin addicts, knew exactly what I meant and laughed at my reply suggested to me that their native intelligence was perfectly adequate to live a normal life. It was not a lack of intelligence that caused them to behave in the way that they did. And I might say that I said exactly the same things to the prisoners as I'm now saying to you, and in the same language. I didn't have to alter my language. Now maybe it's, and they understood me completely. Now maybe it's because what I'm saying is not very intelligent that they could understand me. But of course that's not the explanation that I prefer. I prefer the explanation that they had perfectly adequate native intelligence. It's true that they were, on the whole, very badly educated. The British educational system regularly performs the miracle of spending on average $80,000 per pupil to produce people who are semi-literate. And this seems to me a miracle that our state has produced. And I don't know whether the Brazilian system performs the same miracle, but I rather suspect that it does. However, it is important to remember that educational level is not the same as native intelligence. And I repeat that the native intelligence of these people was perfectly adequate to lead a normal and productive life. The cultural and personal circumstances in which the prisoners grew up no doubt encouraged them to take crime, but nevertheless, the commission of crime required their decision to commit it. And most people with very similar backgrounds did not actually commit crime. And it's rather easy to show, at least in England, that a very large percentage of the crime is committed by a very small percentage of the population. Criminals are not automata. And I think it's also important to remember, and many people forget this, that the real victims of crime are not the rich. They're not people like me. I don't suffer from crime much. I mean, I have to pay extra insurance because of criminality, but I don't actually suffer from crime. It is the poor who suffer the consequences of crime. They are the ones who cannot lead a normal life because they are so afraid of the criminality around them. And for some reason, this rather elementary fact seems not to be very important to quite a large number of people. It is, of course, necessary and just to recognize mitigating circumstances. Any system of justice must recognize mitigating circumstances. As I point out in the book, which I hope you're all going to buy, so that I don't have to commit any crimes. And my thoughts are not original, I must say. The worst crimes are often not committed by the worst people. And the strange thing was, I often found myself ending up liking the murderers in the prison. They were often better than the blackmailers or the drug dealers or even the wife-beaters. Let me give you an instance of a murderer, or in this case, of a murderess, for whom I felt considerable sympathy. She was about 17 when I saw her. I was asked by the courts to prepare a report on her. And she had killed when she was 16. I saw her in the prison. And I was asked by the prosecution to examine her to establish whether she had any medical or psychiatric condition which might have mitigated her offense. Now, according to our law, a person who kills unlawfully is guilty of the lesser offense of manslaughter rather than murder if he or she has a state of mind that is so out of the ordinary as a result of a medical condition that it reduces his or her responsibility. However, being drunk or being under the influence of drugs is not a mitigation in our system if the intoxication is a voluntary one, as it almost always is. Well, the girl in question had stabbed her 15-year-old lesbian lover to death in the course of a quarrel. And there was camera footage of her chasing her victim through the lobby of the apartment block in which they lived. Almost everything now in Britain takes place on camera. We are all film stars, even though we don't know it. And you saw the victim, first you saw the victim run through the lobby, and then her killer, or the person who was going to be her killer, running after her with two knives like this. And it was, they were very ferocious-looking knives. And she caught up with the victim a few yards from the building and stabbed her savagely to death. Well, when I went to the prison to interview her, I must admit that I expected to find an extremely nasty young person. The film of her was truly terrifying. But on the contrary, to my surprise, I found that she was a nice girl who was polite and very well-mannered. Furthermore, the prison record showed that she had behaved well since she was there. In fact, her time in prison, she said, was the happiest time of her life, for reasons which will become clear in a moment. She was the daughter of an alcoholic mother and a father who disappeared before, or possibly just after, she was born. At any rate, she had never had any contact at all with her biological father and did not even know who he was. Her mother particularly liked Jamaicans and took up with another person who was a dealer in crack cocaine and who was in and out of prison himself. And when he was out of prison, he would return to the mother and be very violent towards her, largely through drug-fueled jealousy. He took cocaine. At times, the mother would try and throw him out of the house, but he always returned, and she would always let him back, because really she wanted him to come back. She had ambivalent feelings about him. She would call the police about him, and then, when the police arrived, would say he had done nothing wrong. While the mother, who also took drugs, of course, pursued her very disordered and chaotic existence, she completely neglected the children. And the young girl was sexually abused by her half-brother from the age of 8 to 14, including full sexual intercourse with the brother. And the mother noticed absolutely nothing. But the girl, when she was 14, told her mother what had been happening for so long. And her mother was outraged by the accusation and treated her daughter in the only way she thought she could, by throwing her out of the house onto the street, without any provision for her whatsoever. And the girl made her own way to social services, who put her in a children's home where she stayed for 2 years. Then they thought that she was old enough to fend for herself, and the social services found her a flat to live on her own and furnished it and gave her a small income to manage on. And there she took up with a girl, the girl that she was eventually to murder, who was 1 year younger than she, and who was probably from a similar chaotic background. And not altogether surprisingly, they spent any money that they had on drink and cannabis. And one day they had a drunken, cannabis-fueled quarrel with the results that I have described. Once in prison, this girl was treated for the first time in her life with reasonable dignity, and her life was lived according to some predictable routine and rules that didn't merely depend on someone's feelings of the moment. There was some kind of structure. And being intelligent, she resolved to use her time to gain an education for herself. And I spent quite a long time with her. And before I left her, I said to her, "I've asked you a lot of questions. Is there anything you want to ask me?" And I remember her reply still, because I found it heart-piercing. Though she had been been through so much in her life, she was still really just a child. "Will they be nasty to me in court?" she said. She asked me. Well, I've thought about this case, and of course many other cases, quite a lot down the years. What does it mean? What does it tell us? What are its lessons? And I'm not sure I can say definitively. I can't tell you that the meaning of this story is just one thing. But there are several things that come to my mind. The first is that I recall my presumption against her when I went to see her, from the description of what she had done and the film of her that I had seen of her, that she was a very bad person by nature, and that she was irredeemable. But it was quite wrong. I was quite wrong. I am not against making judgments. In fact, anyone who says that he does not judge other people, is a liar, because I don't believe it is possible to refrain from making judgments, let alone that it would be desirable if it were possible. But judgments have to be made in the light of facts and understanding, and they should be open to evidence. The young woman was found guilty of murder and not the lesser crime of manslaughter because I testified against 3 other psychiatrists. Of course, that pleased me. And the jury believed me and not the other psychiatrists, that had she not been drinking and had she not smoked cannabis, she would not have committed this crime. And since the influence of alcohol and drugs that are taken voluntarily is not considered in law, in British law, a mitigation of an act, you cannot plead that this is a mitigating circumstance, she was found guilty of the more serious crime of murder. However, she was given a sentence of 12 years imprisonment, being the lowest sentence we have for such a crime, which reflected the undoubted effect that her terrible life had hitherto had on her. But it was quite a long time, nevertheless, and it was, to me, a suitable length of time for her to mature as a person and also to obtain a useful education that would allow her to live outside the prison. An education, incidentally, that she would never have received if she had not gone to prison. So the sentence seemed to me both just and humane. But what of the meaning of the story overall? She had been born in relatively impoverished circumstances, and such money as they had, her mother had, she spent on alcohol and cocaine. But they were not circumstances of the kind of poverty that I had seen in Africa, or indeed the standards of poverty that by which man has lived for most of his history. Like many such people, she had never gone cold or hungry. She had never been dressed in rags, and as I have mentioned, she received an education that cost the British state at least $80,000. She'd received free medical care since birth. And the household in which she grew up was furnished with electronic and household appliances that would have astonished Louis XIV. From the physical point of view, her life was actually more comfortable than that of aristocrats at the height of aristocratic power. And her life expectancy was actually almost twice that of members of the British royal family a century and a half earlier. And she would never suffer the physical pain that even the most privileged persons were condemned to suffer in past centuries. But none of these advantages captures the horror, or one might say the complete moral squalor of her upbringing. And it is that we see, or at least I see, as so horrifying. How, you wonder of her mother and her stepfather, can people behave as they behaved? I never met either of them, of course, and they too would have a story to tell, no doubt. So my answer must be provisional. However, unless we are prepared always, in every occasion, to go back to the Garden of Eden and attribute everything to original sin, the explanation has to stop somewhere. And it seems to me that the explanation, or the explanation that I give, is twofold. The first is that in Britain, in any case, we have developed a culture in which there is no agreement as to what is reprehensible social behavior and what is socially unacceptable. We so fear to be censorious that we are prepared to offer no judgment at all. And there has been very unpleasant censoriousness in the past. But now it is worse for us to be thought censorious, that is to say, given to harsh and peremptory moral judgment, than to reprehend the kind of behavior that the young murderess witnessed and experienced throughout her childhood. So if social workers had been called, they would have seen no moral depravity in the way that her mother and her stepfather were behaving. And the second is that there are no real penalties for many people or disincentives to this kind of behavior, the kind of behavior that the stepfather and the mother displayed. The mother, of course, was at the lower end of our economic spectrum and would probably have been little better off. Better off, I mean, from the financial point of view, if she had behaved better. Her income would have been more or less the same. So a lack of prevailing moral standards, other than the duty not to judge others, and a lack of economic incentives combined to render the life of her mother meaningless. And that is one of the reasons, in my view, why so many people seek sensation. And I should point out that religious belief in England is almost non-existent. Of course, we may also add the defects of the social services to the toxic mixture. It is now doctrine that 16-year-olds are capable of independent life, as perhaps there may be a few. Here I should mention that there is talk in England of lowering the voting age to 16, talk that is principally the measure is principally advocated by those who imagine that the 16-year-olds will vote for them. At any rate, acting on the presupposition that a 16-year-old with such a background is capable of taking full charge of her life, the social services cast this girl out into the world, irrespective of the fact that it is obvious that she needed care and protection. And these are our social services that cost us so much money. And this is the kind of story that I heard. This is a very dramatic example of the story, of course, but this is the kind of story that I heard every day, and sometimes many times a day, for 15 years. In these circumstances, prison was actually her salvation. It's a terrible thing that prison should actually be someone's salvation, because the prison was run on reasonably humane grounds. It's a terrible thing that prison should be the saving of someone, but I'm afraid it is the case quite often. And this case was by no means unique in my experience. Let me tell you another story briefly. I was invited by students at Manchester University not long ago, and because students have a very bad reputation in England, I have to tell you that they were very charming, very intelligent, very good students. And they were very welcoming. We have a great deal of intolerance now on our campuses, so that certain speakers are excluded from talking on campuses. But these were very, very good students. Anyway, how I was invited to talk on a panel about prison and whether it served any useful function or not. I think it's fair to say that the British intelligentsia, or the vast majority of the British intelligentsia, believes that imprisonment serves no useful purpose and is merely the expression of society's hypocritical vengeance on those who break its rules and whom it has let down. On the panel with me was a woman who was in her mid-30s, who toured the country addressing meetings on the uselessness of prison. And she said she knew how useless prison was because she spent so long in prison. And so she said that she knew from personal experience that prison was useless. As I said, she had been in prison for 10 years. Now, I deduced from this that she almost certainly had killed someone, because the courts are very reluctant to hand out sentences like that to women who have not done something very serious. And from the little that she said of herself, I gathered that her life had been chaotic in the same way that the young murderess's life had been chaotic, the one that I've just described. And she admitted that in the first 2 years of her imprisonment, she had behaved very badly. And if she had been released, she would have continued her chaotic existence. And she behaved very badly. She was fighting the system. She was fighting other prisoners. Until finally the realization came to her that she wasn't going anywhere, so she might as well use her time constructively. And in fact, she obtained a university degree while in prison, which she never would have done anywhere else. And she now, after her release, went round the country making, in effect, anti-imprisonment propaganda, and very effectively, I should imagine, because she was quite an engaging person, and she had a very forceful way of expressing herself. And because I could not very well contradict her in public, because to have done so would almost certainly have aroused the hostility of the audience, her argument went by default. No one actually confronted her with the contradiction in what she was saying. And I don't think she had ever been confronted with the contradiction in what she was saying. So she went round the country with a completely false and misleading message, but one which would have appealed very strongly to the intellectuals whom she addressed. And it probably would not occur to most of them that she was addressing them thanks to her imprisonment and not despite her imprisonment. So it is with the competing questions of justice, mercy, the need for understanding, and the protection of society and forgiveness that is the theme of my book, which is a personal memoir, but I hope some kind of cause for philosophical reflection. Obrigado pela sua atenção.
Gostaríamos de convidar para fazer a moderação das perguntas o professor Lucas Grassi Freire.
Dr. Daniels. Muito obrigado pela sua fala e pela sua presença aqui conosco. Nós temos algumas perguntas do auditório e eu vou começar pela primeira. Seu mais recente livro, A Faca Entrou, destaca-se por ter sido escrito na maturidade e não no calor do envolvimento com seus pacientes. Que diferenças esse afastamento temporal implicou sobre a sua escrita em comparação com os livros anteriores?
Unfortunately, the translation wasn't. There was a lot of interference. Sorry, I couldn't hear the. Yes. I think it's better outside my pocket. Sorry. What? Yes. Can you repeat the?
Eu vou repetir a pergunta, houve um problema com o aparelho. O seu mais recente livro, A Faca Entrou, destaca-se por ter sido escrito na sua maturidade e não no calor daquele envolvimento com os seus pacientes. Que diferenças esse afastamento temporal implicou sobre a escrita em comparação com os livros anteriores?
I'm sorry, the sound quality. Can you translate?
I will.
The sound quality. I don't know why.
I'll do my best. So, this is a question about your most recent book, this one, and it's saying here that you wrote this at the present moment, far removed in time from your treatment with the patient, and whether that makes any difference from the other books you wrote.
I suppose there's slightly more reflection, because when I wrote, when I was actually working and I wrote about these kinds of things, that it was very present in my mind, and now I'm reflecting a little bit on it. But the kind of experiences that I had were really unforgettable. So I don't think I'm saying anything different in this book that I've said in other books. Perhaps I shouldn't say that, of course. I want you to buy the book. I don't want to. I mean, there's more, shall we say, there's a lot of personal experience in it.
I see, even now you remember some of the lines you heard from
Oh, yes, well, some were unforgettable, really. For example, there was he was a murderer, actually, but he hadn't been charged yet with murder. He was also a kidnapper, and he was charged with kidnap. And a policeman came into the prison and said, and charged him with murder. They decided that he was a murderer as well as a kidnapper. And he was very, very angry. He did a very good imitation of injured innocence. And he came into the room and banged the table and said, "The police are trying to take away my good name." He said, they're accusing me of murder, and I'm not a murderer. I'm not a murderer. And he was so angry that I thought, well, possibly he's not a murderer. After all, sometimes people are falsely accused. So I said, but you are a kidnapper. He said, oh, yes. I said, well, that's quite serious, you know. He said, serious? I said, yes, serious. And he said, well, I don't see that. I said, well, I said, you kidnapped a woman and kept her in a box for 2 weeks. He said, I looked after her well.
Oh, dear.
It's rather difficult to forget things like that.
That surely is unforgettable. Thank you. You've been praised both by the sharpness of the social analysis you make, but also for the quality of the literary style and grace with which you write. Besides this, you've risked some essays in literary criticism, In a section of, this is the Portuguese title, Nossa Cultura, ou O que Restou Dela. And frequently you say that the classical authors already knew much about human nature than later theorists.
Actually more.
Actually more, okay.
Yeah.
So what in your view is more important? Accurate theoretical knowledge or an extensive and rich literary repertoire?
Well, I suppose it depends. The question there is important for what? Important for a career, for an academic career, I would say. Theory is more important. But for knowing the truth, I would say literature. Of course, as you probably, some of you may know, I've written a little book about, a little polemical book, arguing that psychology has not, the study of psychology, which is now maybe 140 years old, scientific study of has added absolutely nothing whatever fundamentally to human understanding. And I don't mean isolated problems. Of course it does help in those isolated problems. But as an illumination of human life, it has contributed nothing and often has prevented an understanding of life rather than contributed to an understanding, because it puts a kind of theoretical screen between understanding, real understanding and reflection, and the kind of understanding that they prefer, which is almost always ridiculous. I mean, I recommend reading Freud, not because I think Freud is right, but because what you will be amazed at is that anybody could ever have taken quite a lot of it seriously. Incidentally, I've come from Porto Alegre, which I understand is the psychoanalysis capital of Brazil. And that's because it's near Argentina. But then the behaviorists are no better. You know, they thought that if they could teach pigeons to play table tennis, they'd explained human life. And all schools of psychology are really ridiculous if their little insights are taken as an understanding of the whole of human life.
In the theoretical literature, there's not much talk about moral reflection.
Well, it's against moral reflection because, of course, it actually seeks to explain, usually seeks to explain in very mechanical terms morality. And so there's a metaphysical problem there, which I'm not a metaphysician, I'm not a philosopher, but it seems to me that there's a metaphysical distinction between any possible mechanistic explanation and a moral explanation, and I don't believe anyone can go through life without making moral judgments. So it's inherent in the nature of our lives that we make moral judgments. We can't not. Even saying that we ought not to make moral judgments is a moral judgment.
Sure.
So I don't think that anyone goes through life without making either aesthetic or moral judgments.
This new question moves us to a more engaged side of things. How should we rebuild the Western system of values and recover our society, in your view?
We should all buy my books.
That's a good start, I guess.
But I have to admit that that might not be enough. I'm not sure, I'm not very good on solutions, but I think it's very important that people of the intellectual class stop telling the kind of, well, perhaps lies is a strong word, but it is the kind of lying that has been going on now for a very long time. And there was one criminologist, a famous criminologist in England, who admitted that the study of criminology for the past 100 years has been an attempt to show that punishment has no effect on behavior. And this is the kind of, I don't know about you, but if I see a speed limit as I'm driving, it's not because I don't want to knock over old ladies that I slow down. It's because I want to avoid the fine if they catch me. And I think it's very important. The intellectual atmosphere has to be changed so that we can begin to tell most obvious truth, because to me, everything that well, of course, I suppose it would, but everything seemed to me to be common sense. It's nothing that I say seems to me of extraordinary intellectual worth, and I have not had an original idea. I'm just saying things which seem to me obvious.
Many people are afraid of saying the same things. It's important that you give us a voice as well.
Yes, well, I mean, it's actually extremely difficult to have an original idea after 2,000 years of civilization.
I have a question here about the welfare state. I'd like to know how we could revert all the damages caused by the welfare state in our societies, and why does the justice system have the tendency to protect criminals and justify their crimes?
Well, if I may answer the second part first, of course, if you have false ideas about human behavior, then you will justify. If you think that human behavior is just a mechanism and nothing else, then you will inherently think have bad ideas with regard to criminality, and you will see crime not as a decision, and not as a decision of free will. And the thing about people who think like that is that they're very condescending, because they don't think of themselves or the people like them in the same way. So they divide the world into two categories. The first being people who are responsible, namely people like us, and them. They're not responsible, they don't know what they're doing, they are actually objects and not people, they're not subjects. I think that explains why they protect people, because they see them as ill in the same way as, say, someone who had Parkinson's disease is ill, or someone who has multiple sclerosis is ill. And in fact, with regard to heroin addiction, that is the official line of the National Institute of Drug Abuse in the United States, an attitude which has spread throughout the world.
It's related to that point, but how then do you talk to someone who sees themselves as victimized, that they're wrong, and that this status is only damaging them?
Well, I don't mean to imply that there are no victims, because of course there are victims. There are many, many victims, and in fact, all of us probably are victims or have been victims at some time in our life. I mean, it's almost impossible to go through life without suffering some kind of injustice or harm done to you by someone else unjustly. So you are a victim. You're all victims, you'll be glad to hear. We are all victims. The important thing is to keep your your sense of victimization, to give it some kind of perspective, and also not to use victimization to stimulate resentment, which is almost the only emotion that can last throughout your life. It can go on forever. It has certain advantages, or no, not advantages, rewards, but it's very, very damaging. So I don't, of course, mean to say that there are not victims, because terrible things are done to people all the time. But if you say to people that you cannot do anything in your life because you've been a victim, actually you are helping to reinforce their passivity so that they won't be able to do anything. And if I may take a slightly controversial, people will perhaps be a bit annoyed about this, but I used to see lots and lots of women, I mean hundreds, probably thousands in my career, of women who had been very badly treated by men. And increasingly women are treating men in this way as well. But mostly the extreme violence, for obvious reasons, was by men against women. And those women were victims of the most disgusting, appalling behavior. I didn't know that such behavior really existed. I mean, if I hadn't done the work I did, I wouldn't have known even that it existed. But when the women came to me, I used to take their histories and I was interested in their story. And I thought it was necessary to point out their complicity in their situation. Because if you didn't point out the complicity, all they could do is wait for someone to come along and do something for them or to them that would resolve their situation. And that was never going to happen. They had to make a decision themselves. And, you know, I would see a woman and I would say, well, how did you meet this man who's abusing you? How did you decide to live with him? And she met him in the pub, in a bar, and she decided to live with him within 30 minutes, knowing absolutely nothing about him. And I could recount a story, a most astonishing story, of a woman who eventually had her eyes put out by her boyfriend with his fingers, who had every possible warning that this man was a monster. And I'm pretty sure that no doctor would ever have told her that she was partly responsible for her own situation. And this isn't to say that I don't think the man should go to prison for the rest of his life, or it doesn't reduce his guilt in the slightest. But it's no good telling victims that you're just a victim and let them wait until they're rescued by someone, because that's not going to happen.
We received many questions from the audience. Unfortunately, we can't ask them all, but thank you very much for participating. I have one last question here. You write a lot about the decline of culture and society in the UK, and I guess many Brazilian readers identify with those arguments because we can see similar things happening around us. So the question is there any hope for Britain? Is there any hope for Brazil and its culture?
Well, yes. And there's hope if enough people bethink themselves, as we say in English, start thinking seriously about these things and saying them. The improvement will only come about if enough people start thinking about these things in a serious way. And I must tell you that I'm very encouraged in Brazil, because everywhere else in England and a few other countries that have ever taken an interest in my book, an audience like this, the average age would be about 93. And about 95% of people would have hearing aids and so on. But in Brazil, many of the people, in fact, the majority of people whom I've met who have been at all interested in what I say are young people, which I think is a very encouraging sign, and which probably wouldn't have been true 20 years ago.
Thank you so much. Congratulations on your new book, and thanks for joining us.
Senhoras e senhores, encerradas as perguntas, gostaríamos de convidá-los para a sessão de autógrafos com o autor, que acontecerá aqui neste palco. Os interessados deverão fazer uma fila deste lado do auditório, a subida será feita pela escada e a descida pela rampa. Desejamos a todos uma boa noite.